Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to start by acknowledging and thanking the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast, if you never miss an episode, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. In today's installment, I'm thrilled to be in conversation with the wonderful Dr. Owen Emmerson. In this episode, we'll explore the fall of Anne Boleyn in 20 key moments. Dr. Emmerson is a social and cultural historian, author, and consultant. He's part of the curatorial team at Hever Castle, Anne Boleyn's childhood home. In 2024, he worked as one of the historical consultants for the BBC adaptation of Dame Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, The Mirror and the Light. Dr. Emmerson was part of the research teams that identified the Book of Hours captured in Hans Holbein's the Younger's portrait of Thomas Cromwell in 2023 and a miniature portrait of Queen Mary I as Princess by Susanna Horenbout in 2024. He's the co-author of 5 books and has contributed to numerous television documentaries, such as The Boleyns, A Scandalous Family, and Holbein's The Ambassadors. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. Now, today's episode is going to be a little bit different in that rather than interviewing a guest, I'm going to be in conversation with a very special guest and a dear friend. So let me welcome Dr. Owen Emmerson. Hello, Owen.
Hello, it's so gorgeous to be back with you.
So, in today's episode, we're going to be looking at the fall of Anne Boleyn in 20 key moments. So, maybe before we dive in, just to say that this isn't an exhaustive list of all the factors that contributed to Anne's downfall. And if you'd like to hear more, Owen and I actually recorded a 2-part series last year. So, you might like to listen to those as well. So, we're also not going to go into huge amounts of depth on every topic because otherwise we'll have you all here for about 5 hours. So, we're going to start, Owen, with 1534. So in 1534, the summer of 1534, Anne Boleyn has what I think was a stillbirth or delivered a stillbirth child. Sometimes this is referred to as a miscarriage. And I'm starting here because I think, of course, this was a tragic moment, but also important in the story of Anne and Henry and what happens. So, as early as January 1534, Anne is actually reported in being again in the family way, so pregnant. Her receiver general actually records in late April that the Queen has, and I quote, a goodly belly. And then on the 26th of June, we hear in another letter that the couple were merry, so they're happy. But then, quite suddenly, on the 2nd of July, the king actually leaves Anne behind at Hampton Court Palace, which is where they were, and moves to the Moor. And when he's there, he calls some of his most important councillors to see him, including Anne's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and also Thomas Cromwell. Now, around that same time, they'd actually been planning a trip to Calais to meet with Francis I. But this is also quite suddenly, cancelled. And Anne's brother, George, is in fact sent to France in all haste in order to delay the meeting. Now, George actually goes with the excuse that Anne's advanced pregnancy is the reason that the couple can no longer travel. But things don't really quite add up. And not long after that, there is absolutely no more mention of the pregnancy, except for Chapuis. He does mention in a letter that perhaps Anne wasn't pregnant at all. But it seems likely to me, Owen, that Anne was delivered of a stillborn child between the 26th of June and the 2nd of July, which is when Henry kind of suddenly leaves her. Now, why we've chosen to start with this point is because I think this had a really powerful psychological effect on Henry. So if we remember back to 1533, Anne, of course, is crowned queen. She is then pregnant at the time of her coronation, and she gives birth to Elizabeth in September of 1533. Elizabeth, yes, is a girl, but she's a very healthy girl. So it seems that things were okay at that point. However, this pregnancy, ending as it did, I think reawakened some demons in Henry and was perhaps a reminder of what had happened in his marriage with Catherine of Aragon. So I think it's an example of Anne, again, and we'll probably talk a lot more about this, not living up to Henry's expectations. What do you think?
Yeah, I think this is a really important inclusion, um, particularly when we're talking about Anne's downfall. Now, I don't think this is the beginning of the end for Anne, but it would have been the beginning of Happy Ever After had
Mm.
this been a
Yeah.
living boy. So it is an important inclusion because I think there's an accumulative effect with the
Yes.
marriage, and in particular with Anne's and Henry's losses with regards to children. Um, Catherine and Henry lost many children, and I think there is this increasing feeling with Henry that history is repeating
Yes.
itself.
Yeah.
And this is probably the moment where that seed sets into Henry's brain. I do want to stress this isn't the beginning of the end for Anne. We know that they have many, many other happy moments
Yeah.
during their marriage, but it can't be ignored that this is a contributing factor, I think. And you know, Catherine has Catherine went through so much heartache, so too does Anne, and I quite agree with you that the sums the dates here just don't add up. I think this is a stillbirth, and you can kind of see why um, George is giving the
Yeah, of
answers, the
course.
excuses that he is. Um, Quite why when Anne is pregnant and in the late stages of pregnancy, a trip would be considered anyway is questionable. So I think that your analysis here is spot on. Um, Really tragic.
It's awful, isn't it? And there has been a suggestion that this was a phantom pregnancy. I think this is based on a letter from Chapuis, who
Yeah,
himself says, "Oh, she probably wasn't pregnant." This is not the last time he'll say something like this, thinking that Anne is playing a game, to keep Henry's interest. But I don't think that makes sense to me, to be honest. I don't think at this point Anne had already had a healthy child. Her mother had, of course, had at least five children, three of which were sons that we know of. I think she would have been quite positive in this respect. However, yes, absolutely tragic. Shall we move? We're going to move into a little bit later in 1534. Owen, do you want to tell us about a certain French embassy that happens in November
yes.
1534?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is essentially a really damning moment in Anne and Henry's relationship, really, particularly if we're looking at how the marriage is affected by international
Yes.
diplomacy. And of course, Anne grew up in France. She knows Francis. She was in his queen's employ. Um, and it is to France that Henry and Anne turned in November 1532 when they needed at least the approval of one major European player for their forthcoming marriage. And I think Anne always hopes that her French connections will bolster her
Yeah.
marriage, will provide something um, that will give meaningful support and even sort of emphasize her status. I have to say, I don't think that if that hope was there for Anne, that they ever really deliver. I don't think they see her as French at all, um, and this is a really very difficult moment for Anne. And I think this is the moment that she knows that France is never really going to follow through. Um, so there is this embassy in 1534, and Henry and Anne believe that the purpose of this visit is to renew their relations by negotiating a marriage between the Princess Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, and the Dauphin, Francis's eldest son, Francis. And tragically for Anne, and much to Henry's astonishment and anger, the Admiral, um, who is Philippe, instead proposes a match between the Dauphin and the Lady Mary.
Mhm.
Now, this would have been absolutely crushing for Anne Boleyn. She does not have a particularly cordial relationship with Mary. We've done a video on that.
We have.
Um, if you want to find out a little bit more about the extent of their woes, which aren't as horrendous, I think, as
Mhm.
we typically are encouraged to think that they were. But what does this say? This says that the French view Henry's illegitimate daughter, and of course, Henry has made Mary illegitimate by annulling um, her mother's marriage, um, as the legitimate heir to the throne and not Princess Elizabeth. This must have been crushing for Anne. Not only is it an insult, but also it calls into question the validity of her marriage, of her title, of her queenship. Um, and we do get reports that the ambassadors are less than courteous towards Anne too. So this compounds this idea that this is an affront to her, that this is a slight against her. And of course, must have feared that the loss of French support for her marriage would be detrimental. Um, the Admiral's secretary in February 1535 notes that Anne confessed her fears and urged him to persuade the ambassador to act. The delay in answering the king's counter proposal, i.e., a marriage between Elizabeth and the Duke of Angoulême, had sparked doubts in the king. And this is a moment of real humbling, I think, for Anne and for Henry, because of course has been scandalized by their marriage, but there was this hope, I think, that at least Francis, if not um, fully supportive, was certainly not hostile towards them. This feels
Yeah.
like a real hostility, a moment of rupture between Francis and Henry and Anne. And I think more broadly, this leaves Henry feeling very suspicious yet again
Mhm.
with, France and the French. And what does this mean for Anne Boleyn? Because, of course, she styles herself as being French. So Anne is in a really vulnerable position here. What do you
Yeah.
think, Natalie?
Absolutely. And just to add that this embassy actually comes right almost weeks after what we call the affair of the placards, which
Yeah.
happened on the 17th and 18th of October. And it was a time where anti-Catholic propaganda broadsheets were actually posted in various places in different cities in France. And there's a suggestion that one was actually posted very close to Francis's private apartments. So just before this embassy, we already see him taking a much hardened stance against, sacramentarians, because this was essentially against the mass, and affirming his Catholicism. So while we know Anne's not a Protestant, she certainly is interested in reformed ideas and is exploring all of this, as we know. So this already, kind of had that embassy starting on a bad foot because, Francis is himself now more suspicious of people who
Yeah.
are known as reformists, and Anne sort of fits that bill, doesn't she? So there's so many interesting things here, and you're so right to point out the crucial role that international affairs have in this marriage, and the
Yeah.
way that they kind of work. It's so important to keep that in mind. I think this is a political marriage in the end, and politics affects what is going on here. And I think the letter that you mentioned from the Admiral's secretary is so important because we don't often get Anne's feelings. And I know that this isn't reported by Anne, but it is certainly reported by the person she allegedly told and spoke to. So we actually have evidence that Anne is feeling uneasy. She's feeling nervous about the situation. She knows she's being watched, and this
Yeah.
is actually what the Admiral Secretary says, that she knows all eyes are on her. She knows she's being watched. So it is, I think it does show that as early as February 1535, Anne is uneasy and knows that things are going on and perhaps not working in her favour.
I
So,
feel really, I feel sort of really, really bad for Anne here because um, court is like a pressure cooker,
yeah,
and all eyes have been on her since around 1526. End of 1526. She has been the
yeah,
person that everyone is looking at. Now, at the beginning of their relationship, Anne does escape to the country, to Hever, on a number of occasions. And I don't think it's necessarily just because it's politically expedient for her to be out of court, i.e., when Campeggio arrives, it's not great to have Anne sort of in the background. Um, but also, I think it's an opportunity for her to get away from that gaze. Ever since she's been made queen, there is no escape, and I think there are a couple of moments where you see that pressure release slightly,
yeah.
notably when they go on progress, because I think they're out of that sort of intense heat of of the courtier's gaze.
Mm.
So yeah, I really feel for her, and this sort of moment where she talks about the fact that she knows that all eyes are on her, I think really highlights just how much pressure she is under. And that's only increased with this French uh, difficulty.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's a good point to just remind ourselves that we are talking about human beings here. We are
Yeah,
talking about, sometimes I think we try and box them, don't we, neatly into good, bad, this, that. But they are, of course, so complex. The situation is complicated and the people are complex, just as we are today, layered, nuanced. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, especially when we're talking about Anne and her fall, because we've heard this narrative so many times that it's difficult sometimes to kind of look at it from a different perspective. Anne is very much under pressure here, and it must have been so horrendous to be the kind of spotlight, to have the spotlight on you for as long as you've said, since around 1526. Everyone's watching her and wanting her to make mistakes. So I do feel that that pressure took its toll on Anne. It kind of eroded her, and we see her later doing some things that she probably has done because she's under stress. But we'll talk about those in a
yeah,
moment. I am going to fast forward, Owen, here quite a bit to the 7th of January 1536. Of course, lots happens in 1535, and perhaps if you're interested in more detail about that, you might like to take a look at my book, The Final Year of Anne Boleyn. I spend a lot of time in 1535. There's a lot going on. Yes, we do see some very joyous moments, especially during that summer progress that you mentioned. Anne falls pregnant again. So there is a lot happening. But we're
yeah,
going to go now to the death of Catherine of Aragon, because I think this is one of those points that we talked about, one of those incredible moments in history where the story shifts quite
yeah,
significantly. So Catherine of Aragon dies at Kimbolton on the 7th of January, 1536. This is a very important moment, Owen, because I think it's when Anne really realizes how vulnerable she is and in what sort
yeah,
of vulnerable position she's in. Because, of course, until this point, Henry had pretty much blamed all his troubles on Catherine of Aragon. Everything was
yeah,
Catherine's fault. And now with her gone, yet there's still turmoil, there's still things that are uncertain. He's looking for someone else to blame. And the other, I suppose, really important thing to note about this very sad event is that before this moment, if Henry decided to annul his marriage to Anne, and really, I think he's probably thought of it by now. I
Oh
actually
yeah, yeah,
quite convinced that he's thought about it by now. Um,
yeah,
if he does, then of course the popular call is going for him to take back is going to be for him to take back Catherine of Aragon. This is what everyone's going to be asking for. This is what everyone's wanted. Majority of people have wanted a reunion with Catherine, but now with Catherine gone, suddenly, if Anne could be removed, Henry is free to once again marry whoever he feels like marrying. So, in a strange way, Catherine and Anne, their stories are so intertwined,
yeah,
and it's incredible that their fates are so connected that as soon as Catherine is gone, she dies and is left in the most vulnerable position she's been in since she's come onto the scene, since she's, been at court. So it's an incredible moment. It's a very sad moment, and there are reports, of course, and we hear them of Henry and Anne celebrating. The reports are contradictory. There's always people talking about the fact that Henry wore yellow. Yes, we
yeah,
do have reports of Henry wearing yellow. Chapuis certainly reports it. Um, I am not so sure about Anne. That they're demonstrating joy, yes. That they're showing Elizabeth off, yes. But I do, that Anne rewards the messenger that brings news of Catherine's death, absolutely. But that is what's required, to be honest. You reward messages. However, I think she very quickly realized that there was nothing to be celebrating here. If anything, perhaps was the fact that finally she's the only Queen of England, briefly, because there'd been two, hadn't there, up until this point.
absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right. Chapuis does detail that Henry wore yellow for the morning. And it's Edward Hall who later in his chronicle will
Right.
say that both Henry and Anne wear yellow. So the closer source doesn't mention what Anne's
Mm.
wearing.
Mm. And I
So
think Chapuis
there
would have
is
loved to have said that Anne was also, dressed in yellow.
definitely so. Yeah. So, there's a big question mark over that. Um, I think there is a period where Anne is relieved because,
Yeah.
throughout her reign, she knows that people have doubted whether she is legitimately a queen. She knows how beloved Catherine is, not just because she hears this, but because she worked in her household. She knows how well respected Catherine is. She is beloved. And just for a short while, she is the only queen. She is the undoubted queen. But of course, she knows that people still doubt that she was ever legitimately married to Henry. People will still believe that it was a bigamous marriage because they were married before the annulment. Some people doubt that Henry had any jurisdiction to oversee an annulment outside of Rome anyway. So I think Anne's vulnerability is absolutely being heightened in the wake of Catherine's death. And it's so ironic, isn't it, that they are each other's saviors in a way. Certainly Catherine is Anne's savior in that regard. Though I don't necessarily think that she acted as one, but just as the mere
Yeah.
fact that if Henry wanted to get rid of Anne, there would have been the question of the previous marriage that would have reared its head again. Um, and actually, in a way, I think the messiness, the complexity, the length of Henry's annulment with Catherine, almost in and of itself, seals Anne's the root of Anne's demise
Yeah.
because it was so messy, it was so protracted, and it left doubt. It left doubt over
Mhm.
the marriage with Anne that never went away. So with Anne dead, but I know we're skipping ahead slightly here,
Yeah.
there can be no doubt that the
Yeah.
next marriage is legitimate. I know that sounds callous, and it is, but I don't think Henry could afford to have another question mark over a third marriage. And
Mm.
ultimately, I think, therefore, that messiness that began back in, 1527, right through to 1533 and beyond, plays a significant part in and of itself of why Anne dies. Um, it's pretty grim.
It's very grim, and but it raises a very good point, and that's why we can't look at the just 2 weeks of May or whatnot
No.
when we're trying to understand Anne's downfall. We do need to go back. We need to go. Actually, we need to know Henry, don't we? Don't
Yeah,
we,
yeah,
to really understand this. However, we certainly need to have a good understanding of Henry and Anne's relationship and exactly the lengths and the trouble that Henry, in Henry's mind, he would have seen it as trouble that happened in regards to this trying to get the marriage annulled. And why did he do all this, Owen? Because he believed that Anne would give him the Tudor son, the heir. So we always need to keep that in mind as well. And I know we've said it, people say it all the time, oh, he wanted an heir. But to really get at the psychological meaning of that, of what Henry wanted, what Anne had promised him, and whether she promised him, outright, or whether Henry just assumed that promise from
yeah,
their relationship is, of course, something we're probably not going to know. Although we do have the notations in the prayer book to think about as well. However, that's what he was expecting. Henry had those
yeah.
expectations of Anne, and sadly, as we know, that's not what happens. But let's move, Owen, to another incident that's often written about, talked about, that occurs on the 24th of January. And this is something that happens in the tilt yard at Greenwich Palace. Can you tell us what that is?
So the jousting accident. Now, I think in Anne's downfall, this has probably had the most different theories surrounding it that don't involve Anne necessarily. I absolutely agree that this is a key moment in Anne's downfall, and there are different theories abound as to what actually happened in this moment. But for me, I have to say that your observations and understanding of this conveyed in your brilliant book about Anne's downfall, for me, are the most compelling. And why I think that is the case really comes from your brilliant analysis of the primary material. So this is an accident that happens in the tilt yard at Greenwich Palace, and we have an account from Chapuis, and I'll read from that now. On the eve of the conversion of St. Paul, the 24th of January, the king being mounted on a great horse to run at the list, both fell so heavily that everyone thought it a miracle he was not killed, but he sustained no injury. Now, Dr. Pedro Ortiz, who is Charles V's ambassador in Rome, reported in early March that he had heard from the French ambassador, who presumably hears it from a source in England, that had been, and I quote, for 2 hours without speaking. Now, this has led to, understandably, a lot of speculation about potential brain damage. If Henry is 2 hours without speaking, then maybe something cataclysmic happened to his brain. Was there a serious concussion or worse? Did it change his personality? Um, However, when we go back to Chapuis's account, there is no mention of this 2 hour with 2 hours without speaking. And also, if we look at Risley's account, who is also in London, he records in his chronicle that Henry had fallen from his horse, but he had no hurt. Risley, in fact, specifies that the king was running at the ring at the time of the accident. Now, this is really, really important. Um, and I totally agree with your analysis that had Henry not been running at the ring, and in fact had been practicing a full joust, he probably would have died.
Mm.
Now, running at the ring is an exercise. It's about precision. It's not partaken with an
No.
opponent. It's literally running at a hanging ring and poking your lance through it to show your accuracy, because of course that's all jousting is about. It's about hurling, yourself on top of a horse at full pelt
No.
and trying to unarm your opponent by hitting them at certain points on the
Mhm.
body. So this is an exercise, and had Henry actually been running at the tilt with an opponent, his horse would have been in full armor. And we know that Henry falls whilst running at the ring, and that he is hurt. Now, I do think this does injure Henry. I think that's without question. I don't necessarily think we have enough evidence to suggest that there is a brain injury here. I don't think Henry's personality does change, if I'm honest. I know that he goes on very shortly to do something unspeakable, killing his wife, but let's be frank, he had killed friends, close friends, just years before. And actually, he'd done some unspeakable things at the beginning of his reign, too. One of the first things that he does when he comes to the throne is killing Emmerson and Dudley for not much reason,
Yeah.
other than sort of bolstering his own popularity by getting rid of the previous regime, as it were. So I don't think we have enough evidence here to suggest a brain injury. I'm always rather cautious about
Yeah.
diagnosing people of the past anyway, but we do know he is physically injured. This reopens a wound in Henry's leg that will continue to um, poison him essentially for the rest of his life. It also means the end of his jousting career. He is never able to show his prowess on the tilt yard again. This is life changing for Henry because he is a warrior king. He always wants his Agincourt moment. And let's face it, he doesn't have the most um, brilliant
No.
career on the battlefield.
Very
You know,
uninspiring, actually.
yeah, I mean, he's always wanting war with France, and he does gain certain territories like Terouanne, but and probably the pinnacle of his military career is the Battle of the Spurs, but they're not Agincourt moments, are
No.
they? And this is probably his way of maintaining that chivalric image of the mighty, powerful war king
Yeah.
by jousting with his courtiers. Now, Emma Levitt comes up with a very, very good point here. Who are his jousting partners at this time? As a boy, it was Thomas Boleyn, but
Yes. Yeah.
now it's people like Norris, Weston, Brereton. Is it possible? And I think it's very likely that they are the men practicing with their king. Do they witness this haphazard moment where the king simply unseats himself and a horse cataclysmically lands on him, ending his career? Is this the moment where he is stripped of his masculinity in front of the very men he will go on to accuse with having adultery with the queen? I think it's very possible, actually, that this is part of the reason why he is willing to sacrifice at least two of his very close friends to the downfall of his queen, because in this moment he was utterly emasculated in front of them. What do you think, Nat?
It is such an important moment, and it he was embarrassed.
Yeah,
Henry fell doing something he'd done, I don't know, thousands of times probably since he was a young boy. So whenever he started jousting, it's an incredible moment. And I think I can understand why people have thought that there was some sort of tournament on at Greenwich, that this was the king jousting in some kind of competition. We know if that had been the case, Anne would have been there.
Yeah,
And Emma Levitt shows she went through all the primary sources. There was no jousting event, formal event held at that point. So this is Henry practicing, and we know that anyway from the contemporary accounts. He's running at the ring. That's a very specific activity, as you've already mentioned. So this is Henry out with his courtiers, doing what they do, and he falls over essentially, and the horse
yeah,
falls on him. So it's had a huge, it's completely injured his ego. Of course, we know this is a man with a huge ego who often, feels inadequate. And when he
yeah,
feels inadequate, he is at his most dangerous.
yeah,
And some of the men you've just mentioned that, yes, end up on the scaffold not long after are men that will continue to joust. George Boleyn, we know they're the stars of the May Day joust, these
yeah,
exact same men. So we have to consider the possibility, that this had something to do with the fact that they are selected almost, to be executed alongside the Queen. So it's such an interesting moment. I think Emma's theory is compelling. I do think it's really
it
compelling
is.
because these are the men that will continue to surround Anne as well, men that are
Yeah,
able to go on to the tilt yard to show their virility. So now basically the king needs another way of affirming his power
yeah,
and showing his manliness and his virility. How's he going to do that? He can't do it on the tilt yard anymore. So it's a very, very interesting moment. I'm going to move just only really a couple of days ahead in the timeline
yeah,
here, Owen, to another event that I do find very difficult to discuss, to be honest with you. And this is Anne's final miscarriage, which most sources, or a lot of people, a lot of books say happened on the day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral. So that day was the 29th, and there's a reason why that story has been told, and it's because Chapuis reports it. So the details appear in a letter that Chapuis writes to Charles V on the 10th of February. So the letter obviously is later than the events that have happened, but he tells the emperor that on the 29th of January, so the day of Catherine's funeral, Anne miscarried, and I quote, a male child. And he says that it was about they thought that the child was about 3.5 months old. Once again, we have Charles Risley's account that does agree with Chapuis, although he says that the miscarriage actually happened on the 30th of January. And he provides us with some more details. So he says, and I quote, that Anne herself had reckoned herself at the time but 15 weeks gone with child, end quote. Now, I do think that this slight discrepancy is important, and it points to the fact that I think Anne may have suffered a long miscarriage.
yeah,
So I think it's likely that she began experiencing symptoms pretty soon after this fall. Now, we've said that it doesn't seem likely that Henry was unconscious for 2 hours. That source is not always very reliable, the person who actually commented on that. And we have the two English sources that tell us that the king was okay. Furthermore, we've got Cromwell that very soon after reports the king's up and about. And we have no record to say that Henry's not up and about. It does seem
yeah,
that the injury was to his ego. And yes, perhaps, as you've said, it affects his leg and opens up an old wound. But I think he's still, up and about. So I think that suddenly we know something happened between the fall and the 29th of January, but the date has always just been assumed. Yes, it happened on that day. I actually think we need to consider that it was a long miscarriage that happened around that time.
yeah,
Now, Chapuis actually reports on the 29th of January as well. He does write a dispatch on that day. And he reports that that morning, in fact, he'd gotten word that Henry had been complaining. He'd been complaining to people about his lack of male heirs. Now, this makes absolutely no sense if Anne's pregnancy is still, progressing well. So it's a bit of a convoluted story, and I would encourage people to read the full account in my book because I do go into further detail. But basically, the dates to me don't add up for this having happened on the 29th. I think by the 29th, Henry's aware, unfortunately, that
yeah,
Anne is either in the process of miscarrying or that she's already lost the baby. Um, we do need to ask why Chapuis would report this then, because we know that Chapuis is trying to report accurate information to his master. He doesn't
Yeah.
want, he's not trying to deceive him, you know. I think it's because this is a story that would have been told. Let's remember the age that we're talking about. This is a very patriarchal society. You know, women are considered inferior in every way. They're considered either they're sort of the sinful one, aren't they? They're the ones that lead men
Yeah.
astray. They're the ones that are responsible for the bad things that happened. And Catherine of Aragon, on the other hand, is held up as this model, this example of what women should be like. And there's good reason for that, of course. She had a very successful reign. But I think this is essentially a morality tale, Owen, a way of saying, look how God punishes the sinful Anne by this tragic event of losing her child and a male child on the day of the funeral of the good Queen Catherine. So I think we need to really get into the mindset of the period we're talking about to assess this event properly. It's horrendous, however you look at it. Yes, she lost her baby, however you look at it, but I think it's likely. And in fact, Chapuis later reports that Anne herself blames it on the shock she got, the scare she got at Henry's fall. If you put all of it together, it seems that Henry was out practicing, had the accident, was okay, but somebody has come to report it to Anne, and that she was so afraid because, let's remember, Anne relies on Henry for her protection. There's nothing else she's
Absolutely.
got. She doesn't have a single other thing. Henry is the only one that can keep her safe. And if she feels that something's happened to him, that's a terrible shock, and she says that that's what caused her miscarriage. And I think we need to believe her. So it's tragic, of course, because I think this is a real turning point in terms of Henry's way of looking at Anne. I think this sealed the deal in terms of the fact that he now sees that God is not going to grant him a son with Anne. And I think he's already been thinking about it, but he puts more energy into finding a way out of this marriage. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you deal with this very, very beautifully in your book, and it's a very, very difficult subject. I do think historically, Chapuis used it as a almost like a karmic moment.
Yep.
He simplified the narrative, and actually, we still see some historians do this in their narratives as well. Um, I I think that your explanation of the difficulty with dates absolutely suggests that this is a long miscarriage. Miscarriages aren't always contained to a day, a date. They can go on for considerable amount of time. So I think this is it's one of the many awful parts of Anne's downfall, and you know, we do have to believe her. It's very important to believe her. That was her explanation of what had happened. And I think it's very important. We've already discussed the fact that France have all but abandoned her. For her losing this son with, the king's mortality in question, um, the pressure on her is astronomical. Um, what would life look like without Henry? Um,
Yeah.
it would be really quite bleak indeed, I should imagine, because you and I have tried on several occasions to try and count on our hands the amount of people who truly support Anne at court. There aren't many.
No.
So without him, she's toast.
Yeah.
Um, but also in this moment, um, I think this is the moment that all of Henry's concerns and fears are brought straight into sharp relief. And I think it is this moment that he likely says to Cromwell, I want out of this marriage.
Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
th- I think this is the turning point.
It's
Um,
heartbreaking, isn't it? I think in my book I said something along the lines of this is when he closes his heart to Anne.
yeah,
But I know, Owen, you and I have been discussing this a lot behind the scenes. I don't know whether his heart was ever open to Anne in the first place. This is obviously not the time to dig into that, and perhaps we can in the near future record an episode about what we've been thinking about that relationship. However, as you've said, it is absolutely a turning point. He now feels, as in Henry now feels, justified to do what he's about to do. And of course, Anne could not have guessed what was to come. She doesn't have the benefit of hindsight like we do. But there is another moment that's yeah, about to change this story significantly. And it's the first mention of Jane Seymour, isn't it, Owen?
It is. It absolutely is. And interestingly, it's on the 10th of February,
Yeah.
1536. Um, I think we're encouraged in popular culture to see her as a much more sort of established presence in Henry's um, gaze. But yes, this is the first time that she is recognized in
Yeah.
official dispatches, of course, in the paper trail, in the sieve, um, and that is that Henry Chapuis, sorry, notes that Henry has lately been giving her many gifts.
Yeah.
Now, it's not much of a mention, but it does tell us something, doesn't it? That the
It sure
king
does. Yeah.
is giving gifts to one of Anne Boleyn's ladies in waiting. And where have we heard that story before?
Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And that's absolutely why he's mentioning it, because it's important. It's like the first sighting of a beacon on the horizon, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's, you know, it might be nothing, but it looks like it could be something.
Yeah.
Um, so yes, that is our first mention
Oh,
of Jane.
yeah.
Um,
I do
yeah.
start getting nervous at this time in the
Yeah.
timeline, I have to say. And yes, I think also important probably to note that as you've said, this is the first time that she's mentioned, I should have probably noted in association with Henry. Of course, he
Yes.
appears
Yeah.
in other
Yeah.
sources. However, specifically as Henry paying attention to her and giving her gifts. And this, I suppose, isn't uncommon when we think that Anne had been pregnant until very recently. And this is what Henry does, doesn't he? When his wives are
Yeah.
pregnant, he then looks for another woman to kind of pursue in this sense of courtly love. However, of course, sometimes it turns into something else. So the timing fits, I think, that perhaps he started paying attention to Jane when Anne fell pregnant, because, of course, at this
Yeah.
time, it's seen as very dangerous for couples to continue engaging in sexual relationships when the woman is pregnant. So Henry and Anne wouldn't have been sleeping together because that wasn't what was advised at this point. So he's essentially looking for someone else to kind of flirt with. But I think this case is a little different to some other perhaps cases. And that's the fact that we have this added element now that Henry is looking for a way to show his prowess that
Yeah.
isn't on the tilt yard or in the tilt yard. He's looking for a way to show his power, his domination. He's still king. And so perhaps this was one avenue that he used in order to do that. Um, there's also maybe important to note the suggestion that when something goes wrong with the woman's pregnancy at this point, that there is perhaps a question about the man's virility.
Yeah.
So he's needing to certainly prove himself at this very tragic time. And of course, he just doesn't care about how Anne's feeling. Unfortunately, the sources tell us that he leaves her. He goes off. He does what he does, doesn't he? He sort of closes that chapter, turns his back, and moves on. Of course, at this point, it's not permanently just yet, but he has left her alone with her women to kind of deal with this awful, awful event. And now he's paying court to Jane Seymour and giving her presents. But Anne is a tough cookie, isn't she, Owen?
She
She's,
is.
she perseveres. She perseveres, and she is courageous, and she's strong, and all those things initially attracted Henry, but I think now they're grating on him, to be honest. So
Definitely
she
so.
does something in response to all of this. She, of course, knows that he's paying court to Jane Seymour. She's not silly. She knows how her relationship with the king began and how things evolved. She was Catherine's lady in waiting. So she needs to respond. And one of the ways she chooses to do this is by essentially weaponizing her almoner, John Skip. So this is moment 7, everyone, and it is the Passion Sunday sermon that so many people talk about. And it is an important moment. It's an incredibly important moment. So
Yeah.
a couple of things to say maybe before we touch on this, and that is that I've been doing some research on this, and I'm not the only one. There are other historians that are doing ongoing research into this particular sermon because nothing's ever straightforward in Tudor history. We actually do not have something like a transcript of what John Skip delivered that day to the court. So what does survive, because there was no one there noting it down. Imagine you're just
Yeah.
attending a sermon, you don't have your pen and paper out, or you're not recording it. So what we do have are drafts. We have a number of drafts of this sermon that exist, a very long sermon. That's the other thing probably that isn't made obvious when this is spoken about. This I think probably Owen would have taken about an hour and a half to 2 hours to deliver.
Yes.
This
Yeah.
is what people sat through, these sermons, and it's around Easter. So of course there's lots of sermons being delivered. So this is just one of them. And so we have a couple of drafts. We also have, and this is what most historians actually discuss when talking about this, we have 2 hostile reports of the sermon. So
Yeah.
he it's obvious that he delivered something that Henry found offensive, because this is why there are reports of it made, and this is why he's in a bit of trouble and he's actually questioned. Or the evidence suggests that there was at least the intention to question him as well. I should
Yeah.
just probably point that out. Nothing ultimately happens to him, but there's certainly something that the king has been offended by. And
Yeah.
within this hugely long, long sermon, he makes, it seems, according to the reports, that he has cited the example at some point of Solomon. So, and I quote, to show that he lost his true nobility towards the end of his life by taking new wives and concubines. Now, can you imagine delivering this in front of the king, who's just a couple of months before made his interest in Jane Seymour quite obvious? I just, I don't think John Skip would have taken it upon himself to do this if he didn't know
No.
that he had Anne, at the very least, Anne's support and approval. He later goes on to also enlist the biblical example of King Ahasuerus. So if we know the story, and everyone sitting listening to this sermon would have known all of these stories, he was tricked by his wicked minister Haman into ordering the execution of all his Jewish subjects. The people, however, Owen, are saved, and that is by the intervention of the king's good wife, Esther, who, of course, Ahasuerus loves and trusts. And guess what? The wicked minister is executed. Now, the allusions are so obvious to a Tudor audience. What he's talking about here, of course, the gentle, wise king is Henry VIII. His wicked minister is Thomas Cromwell. The Jewish people are the clergy. And the massacre is talking about the monastic suppressions, that are going on at this point. Because remember, around this time, the lesser monasteries are dissolved. And the good Queen Esther is, of course, Anne Boleyn, Queen Anne Boleyn. And, this isn't the first time she's connected herself with Esther, and she's not the first Tudor queen to do it either.
No,
Um,
not at all.
so I think it's a really interesting moment because I think it shows, firstly, Anne's mettle. She's tough. She's fighting back. She is, using a modern phrase, speaking truth to power here. She doesn't agree with the full dissolution of the monasteries. She is not, of course, opposed to reform, but she doesn't want to use the wealth from these monasteries just to fill Henry's coffers. It's clear that Anne knows that monastic reform is needed, and we can't go into that in full detail. But I think she hoped that the legislation would ultimately be of benefit to people and
Yeah.
to educational institutions that she's a very avid patron of. I think it's the attack on Cromwell, Owen, that is most dangerous in this particular sermon. I think if we're looking for a moment where this turns deadly, I suggest that this may be it, to be honest with you. Yes, I think the miscarriage set Henry on a certain path, but I think he still wasn't quite sure how this was going to come about and what was going to happen. And I think now with this direct, very thinly veiled, pretty direct attack on Cromwell and on some of Henry's policies, things change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We know that Anne has already threatened Cromwell. Um, we know this has been
Yeah,
done privately, because Cromwell tells Eustace Chapuis that the Queen has threatened that she would like his head,
yeah,
um, and now it's made public. And there's one thing you don't do with Thomas Cromwell, and that's send a warning shot across his bows, because he doesn't do that to people. He pounces.
yeah,
He doesn't give warnings to anyone because it gives that other person the upper hand.
yeah,
And that is unfortunately, tragically, what happens here. And again, is threatening Cromwell, but doing so publicly. He has no choice now but to make a response.
mhm,
And he's not going to do it by threatening the Queen. He's going to do it by bringing her down
mhm.
without her even knowing that he's playing all of the cards. Um, I think this, in a way, is Anne's moment of putting her cards on the table. But what she hasn't realised is that she's no longer holding the king.
Yeah, yeah,
I think she still thinks that she's holding the king, but she's not. And I'm not saying that Cromwell is holding the king, but what she doesn't know is that Henry already wants out of this marriage.
yeah,
And in a way, she's given Cromwell the perfect get out clause,
mhm,
because now it does turn deadly. I think this is the moment. I think you're absolutely right. This is the moment where we're at a crossroads, and there could have been a banishment and an annulment and a
mhm.
convent in the equation before this moment, but not after.
No,
Um, it Cromwell cannot let Anne come back into the king's affections. He and I do think we have to take a little leaf out of Hilary Mantel's book. And I think we have to try and look at this from Cromwell's perspective as well. Um, Courtiers who wield the power that he does only survive by the good graces of the king. We know what his fate is going to be. And in a way, when someone does this kind of work, it's kind of a question of, if not now, when, in terms of their
yeah,
own fate. I mean, look at the sort of fate of his predecessors. If we look at Cardinal Wolsey, who dies on the way to the Tower, Thomas More, um, you know, uh, it's not a great record, is it?
no,
Of being Henry's right hand man. Um, so he does actually have to defend himself,
mm,
and this is not a justification for what he does, um, but it is an understanding of what this moment means to him. Because yes, Anne, who is characteristically, I think, quite fiery, has already threatened him, but now she's made that threat incredibly public. Um, I
yeah.
don't think he has any option now but to make sure that he's the one with the bullet in the barrel.
Yeah, it's messy, isn't it? It's messy, it's complicated,
Yeah.
but this is essentially what we're dealing with. And you're so right. I think the previous threats that Anne had made, and she'd made exactly that, saying she wanted his head.
Yeah.
This is back in 1535. This is how long, and this is why I think we also need to question that narrative of them being buddies,
Oh
Cromwell and
yeah.
Anne. I don't think they were ever friends and close allies. Yes, they worked together when Henry wanted both of them by his side. The moment that ends, things change and everybody, shows their true colors. So I think it's very important that at this point, and again, we couldn't cover every moment, but at this point, when Cromwell is in fact feeling vulnerable, he's
Yeah.
understood. that perhaps he doesn't have Henry's complete trust, that he doesn't actually control the king.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone controlled Henry. I think the most predictable thing about Henry is how unpredictable he actually was. So I think Cromwell has realized. Firstly, we're talking about Anne. We're talking about an incredibly powerful woman. Yes, she's divisive, but she can, there are some people that are incredibly loyal to her. So he can't take his chances. He cannot. He absolutely cannot. If he wants to survive, he needs to do something. And I think we're going to skip to another moment that people often see as doom and gloom, to be honest, for Anne and the Boleyns, Owen, and that is the Order of the Garter appointment. So what can you tell us about the Order of the Garter in 1536? What happens?
Yeah, this is again not a good sign for Anne Boleyn. There's a yearly chapter meeting of the Order of the Garter, which is held at Greenwich. Now, George Boleyn is one of a number of men who are nominated. Now, you might assume that George Boleyn would have it in the bag because he is the Queen's brother, but this is not his first nomination, and he is relatively young. He was also nominated in 1531, 1532, and 1535. So this is his fourth time at the rodeo. But on the 24th of April, the king announces that it is Sir Nicholas Carew who is successful in being elected to the Order of the Garter. Now, this isn't in and of itself a signal that Anne has lost favour, because we could say the same for 1531, 1532,
Yeah.
and 1535, because George loses the nomination on those occasions too. But I do think it is significant that Carew is part of the I don't want to necessarily call it a faction, because I think that has um, connotations relating to theories that I don't necessarily um, hold with. But Carew has certainly put his money on the Seymour path. So I think if we're looking at this um, from that perspective, the honour has gone to someone that is firmly in the Seymour camp.
Mhm.
Um, so I don't necessarily think that at the time this to courtiers would have, sort of signified that this is a definitive
Yeah.
point of in Anne's downfall. Um, but I definitely think when we step back and look at the bigger picture, that this is indicative of influence waning away. This must have been a blow to the Boleyns.
And that's certainly
Um,
how Chapuis sees it, doesn't he? Because that's exactly what he reports, that the Queen couldn't
yeah,
get it for her brother, basically.
yeah. It's an indication that things are starting to slip away. Um, and it must have been a massive blow for Anne, for Thomas, and for George. This would have been slightly humiliating as well. That you know, and wasn't able to swing it for him. So yes, this was not a happy day for the Boleyns.
No, no, it wasn't. And as you've said, if we just pluck this out, it doesn't seem like much. But I
Yeah,
think when you consider it in the context of what's going on, then of course it takes on a much darker interpretation. But what happens next, pretty much, Owen, leaves very little doubt about what is happening here. As you've mentioned, Cromwell wouldn't want to give Anne the upper hand by letting her know what's going on. So a lot of this has been happening behind closed doors.
yeah,
We have to stress that as well, that there are reports of people saying what's happening because people are spending a lot of time behind closed doors. Cromwell's taken ill and he's in his bed apparently, for a long time. But of course, what he's doing is just nutting all this out. I think it probably was kept quite close between Cromwell and Henry for a time. But what happens next changes things, and that is that Henry, by all accounts, and some people disagree with this, approves the setting up of two commissions of Oyer and Terminer. So they are to investigate offences committed in the counties of Middlesex and Kent. And it specifies unspecified treasons. So Anne's uncle, Thomas Howard, is assigned to both of those commissions. But Thomas Boleyn, and we get a lot of confusion about Thomas Boleyn's role in all of this, he is appointed to the Middlesex Commission. These do not specifically mention Anne or any of the men, and they're not signed by the king. Although they're obviously written in Henry's voice, which is how these documents are penned. But I think it is Ives, the wonderful Professor Eric Ives, that concludes that maybe Henry didn't know about this. Maybe this is Cromwell doing this on his own. I don't know about that. I think I have to respectfully disagree with that. I think that Henry would have known about this. Um, so, is this then, we have to consider, Henry's first formal move against Anne? And, it's an interesting thing to think about. I don't think there's any coincidence, Owen, in the fact that this comes literally days after, on 18th of April. We didn't discuss it. We could have had an extra point. Something happens where Cromwell is given a serious public dressing down by Henry. It's incredibly embarrassing. It really affects him. He takes to his bed after that, pretty much. These commissions of Oyer and Terminer come just days after that. So is this Cromwell acting alone? Is this Cromwell acting on Henry's order? We can debate that, but certainly these commissions are set up. There's also been the suggestion that they weren't set up to investigate anything to do with Anne. I also consider that quite unlikely. I think it is quite obvious that these have been set up uh, in order to bring down Anne and the men that are charged alongside her. We've said that Anne is pretty much being kept, well, trying to be kept in the dark, but she is so politically savvy. She obviously is picking up things that are going on. I imagine that after being a courtier for as long as she has been, and then a queen, surrounded since she was 12 years old by kings and queens and courtiers and all of this, that she has gotten a sense that something is going on, that something's not right. And she, in fact, does something that kind of proves that, doesn't she, On?
Yes, I think Anne absolutely is politically astute. She knows that the tide is turning. She might not know what the future is going to look like. She doesn't know where that tide is going to carry her, but she knows that things are wrong. Things are changing. And we know that on the Wednesday, the 26th of April, Anne meets with her almoner, Matthew Parker. Now, we don't know the precise details of what this conversation was. So we know about this because Matthew Parker will much later tell Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, that he will accept the position of being her Archbishop of Canterbury, because of the conversation that he had on Wednesday, the 26th of April, where he made some kind of promise to Anne. And in a way, Parker is saying to Elizabeth, this is me continuing to discharge that promise that I gave to your mother. Therefore, I think we can suppose that Anne entrusted Parker with some kind of care over Elizabeth. She entreated him to have some kind of care, perhaps over her spiritual well-being. And in 1572, he says to Lord Burleigh, if I had not been so much bound to the mother, I would not so soon have granted to serve the daughter. So I think we can see here again that it is because of the love that he had for Anne that he is willing to discharge this service for Elizabeth. He was obviously very, very fond of her. And she obviously trusted him greatly to, give this responsibility to him. I don't think we can get a sense here that Anne knows what's going to happen,
No.
but she knows something's going to happen. Doesn't know what. Um, I don't think we can discern from this that she thinks she's going to die. but she knows that she might not have control over Elizabeth for much longer. I think that
Yeah.
is tragically all too clear here. She knows what Henry does at the end of a marriage.
Hmm.
You know, Catherine never saw her daughter again. You
No.
know, how horrific is that? She was never permitted to see her daughter again. And in this moment, Anne undoubtedly knows that she probably will not have close contact with Elizabeth going forward. Um, and therefore, she is asking someone very close to her to have
Yeah.
a care for her. Um, Heartbreaking, really, isn't it?
Oh, it's so heartbreaking and also in a way so touching that, you mentioned the quote to Lord Burleigh in 1572, and he's still
Yeah,
remembering Anne Boleyn.
yeah,
That is quite a testament, to the woman that she was and the effect certainly that she had on some people. So
it
amazing,
is.
absolutely
I
amazing.
I always love that in his the inventory of his goods that are taken after his death, he has a corridor portrait collection. Um, but there are two which are valued at a higher price, and they are one of those two is a portrait of Anne Boleyn, which suggests that it's not part of a corridor set, that it was a separate, larger portrait. So he continued to display a portrait of Anne. Whether or not it was created in her lifetime, we're not sure. But yeah, I always
Yeah,
love the
it's very
fact that
moving, isn't it?
in his possession was a portrait of Anne. Um, I think that tells us a lot.
Yeah, and that he served Elizabeth as well is
Yeah,
quite interesting, isn't it? So we're starting to speed up here on because this is reflecting what was going on at the time, and certainly things began
yeah,
to speed up. So if you want to let Henry off the hook for the cases of Oyer and Terminer, I don't think you can let him off the hook for the next one, and that's that Parliament is summoned.
yeah,
Now, this is the 27th of April. It's suddenly summoned. This is a very bad omen for Anne and her supporters because the Reformation Parliament had only just been dissolved a fortnight earlier. So
yeah,
this is something serious. Something is going on. Something's happening here, or I should say, to deal with the legal repercussions that will come about from Anne's downfall. Not just that, on that same day, the Bishop of London, Sir John Stokesley, is consulted to see if Henry can, and I quote, abandon Anne. Now, this line of questioning doesn't come specifically from Henry. We don't know if he's the one that's instigated. I would say he is the one that's instigated it. However, regardless, it suggests that at this point, this is the way, this is the path that they've chosen. And it also tells us that they've got no evidence against Anne at this point. No
no,
evidence of her wrongdoing because they're looking for different ways to get out of this still at this late point, 27th of April. And I know Diarmaid MacCulloch interprets these events as, and I quote, the stages of Anne's doom. I have to agree, all of these things are building up to something. Anne doesn't know, of course, exactly the extent of what is happening, but she's concerned enough to be thinking about Elizabeth. And you're right, I think she probably thought that her marriage would be annulled, that she would be banished and have no contact with Elizabeth, perhaps sent to a convent, which is why she's asked Matthew Parker to keep an eye out on Elizabeth. So it's awful what she must have been going through at this point. But things are about to get a whole lot worse. And our 12th moment are some conversations, Owen, that she has. One with Mark Smeaton,
yes,
the court musician, and one with the king's groom of the stool, the greatly favoured and admired Sir Henry Norris. So tell us a little bit about what happens.
yes. So these either both happen on the same day or they happen a day apart.
Yeah.
So on Saturday, the 29th of April, Anne finds the court musician, who is often to be found in her chambers, looking despondent. And Anne approaches him and essentially asks, "What is the matter?"
Yeah.
And he retorts saying, "It was no matter." And in typical Anne fashion, she rebukes him, for want of a better word. She says, "You might not look to have me speak to you as I should do to a noble man, because ye be an inferior person." Now, this is typical Anne. She is something I would say of a snob. She's putting him in his place.
Yeah.
essentially saying, this is not my problem. Why are you here burdening me with, this is how I always read it. Why are you, I don't pay you to sit here to look sad. I've got my own troubles. We shouldn't be having this conversation. Get on with your music. That's
Yeah,
what I
pretty
get it,
much.
how I interpret this. And Smeaton replies with, a look sufficeth me, and thus fare you well. This is not something on the face of it that looks like anything but, you know, passing conversation, and probably is reflective of the state of mind that Anne is in. She's probably got a lot more on her plate than Mark Smeaton right now. So Anne's continental education ensured that she was well versed in the rhetoric of conversations, of courtly love. And as Queen, Anne was required to demonstrate the ideals of womanly behaviour, such as submissiveness and chastity, while simultaneously
Mm.
playing a central role in the culture of courtly love, which involves this flirtatious repartee. And I think Anne here is really struggling to tread that tightrope under pressure, essentially. And they are contradictory roles, aren't they?
So much so, yeah.
And I think her inability at times to, you know, sort of negotiate this tightrope act, of flattering on the one hand, but being virtuous and submissive on the other. It must have been slightly exhausting because it is a contradictory position. And one of those moments, I think, either happens on the 29th or the 30th of April. And it is, of course, as you mentioned, with Sir Henry Norris. And essentially, here we have a fairly typical conversation about why Henry Norris has not yet married. And he talks about wishing to tarry a time. And of course, Anne delivers the now infamous line, you look for dead men's shoes, because if it aught but good were to come to the king, you would look to have me. Now, this is again, it's definitely part of that chivalric tradition. It is flattering Norris, but she's not quite hit
No.
the line here. And very unfortunately for Anne Boleyn, she has mentioned, I think absolutely inadvertently, the death of the king. And this is a massive issue, essentially.
Mm.
Now, this conversation will not be detailed in the indictment against her. It is not mentioned
Yeah.
anywhere in Anne's trial records. But I think this is the moment when this gets back to Henry and Cromwell, that they make up their mind about what is to happen to Anne Boleyn, because I think the light bulb, of
Hmm.
course they didn't exist in the 16th century,
The
the
candle.
candle the candle ignites, the tinderbox strikes, and they've got her because she has mentioned the king's death. And of course, the act of supremacy and the treason act that came with it, um, explicitly to protect Anne and Henry and their heirs, will be used against her. Because it's not enough to prove that someone is plotting the king's death. Just imagining the king's death, the speaking about the king's death is now treason. The very law that was there to protect Anne, the marriage, Henry, the heirs, is now going to be used against her. And of course, this is a flirtation. She's talking about, a relationship with him, and I just think it's so obvious to me that it's at this moment that those central charges, adultery and treason, by imagining the king's death, by plotting the king's death, suddenly come together, don't they?
Yeah.
And I think Anne knows the significance of this as well. She orders Norris to go to her almoner to swear that she is a good woman. And I think it's too late.
It's
I
too
think the
late.
damage is done.
And it's so heartbreaking to watch this all unfold because
Yeah,
you just feel for her so much because she's under so much pressure. She's so stressed, and you can clearly understand why she's not thinking straight. I think an Anne Boleyn at her peak would have known that this was a conversation that you were not going to have, especially not at this moment. It's interesting because we know the details of these incidents from her own recollections when she's
yeah,
imprisoned in the tower and she starts talking. She's trying to work, she can't work out what she's done. So she's doing what anyone else would do. Was it maybe when I did this, or maybe when I said that? We all do that. We have those moments. And this is what Anne does when she's in the tower. And this is why we know to this extent what happened. However, I think, Owen, that the second those words came out of her mouth, it was carried to Cromwell and to Henry,
definitely.
and that this
Yeah,
is why, exactly as you've said, very soon after, and this takes us to another point number 13, moment number 13, which is a confrontation that happens this same weekend. This is a
yeah,
crazy weekend at the Tudor court between Anne and Henry. Now, I do have to say that this event is recalled much later. It's actually
yeah.
witnessed by Alexander Less, who's a Scottish theologian, and he later recounts this to Elizabeth in a letter to Elizabeth. So it's not recounted until 1559. But he says that he witnessed around this time, 30th of April, a very heated debate between Anne and Henry. And this is a moment we've seen recreated on screen. And it is quite a powerful moment because Anne is carrying little Elizabeth in her arms and Henry's angry. So this is what Alessa has seen. Henry's angry about something and Anne is trying to placate him and she's doing that with Elizabeth in her arms. It's quite a heartbreaking moment because we know she has very little time left with her daughter at this point. Is he just saying this to placate Elizabeth later, or is this something he's witnessed? But I think, given what we know happened on that weekend, it
Yeah.
makes sense. It makes sense because Henry must have discovered, what Anne was saying. He's interpreted it in one way, or he's convinced himself, I should say, to interpret it in a way. And he's cranky with Anne. He's angry at her. And we know this as well because of the next thing that actually happened. So I do think there was an exchange. I think we know Elizabeth was with Anne at this point. We have records for that. Her mind is certainly on Elizabeth. These are the last things Anne is thinking about is Elizabeth's welfare and Elizabeth. We know this. Um, but then a certain trip is then cancelled. And it's
It
rare.
is.
It's rare to know something to be able to pinpoint it so precisely like we can, Owen.
Yeah, it's at 11 p.m. on
Yeah.
the 30th of April, same day that the trip to Dover is postponed. And this is reported by Thomas Worley. Um, this is, again, so indicative of the fact that there has been a rupture
Mm.
at court. This is a very last minute cancellation. Um, because something has happened. Something significant has happened. Now, we don't know, as you say, what that conversation was because Alexander didn't know what the conversation was. He was witnessing it, but couldn't hear what was being said. But I think what we have to deduce here is that Henry has confronted Anne. We aren't particularly sure what it is that he's confronted her about. Maybe she's confronting him.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
there are heated words going on here. Um, and I think if everything wasn't clear to Anne Boleyn on the 30th of April, they certainly were on the 1st of May, because this is the day of no return, isn't it?
It really is. And, that's interesting. I'm just thinking about what you just said about that it may have been Anne confronting Henry. And I actually think that makes a lot more sense given what we know of Henry, given
Yeah,
that we know that once he has decided something, he doesn't want to see that person. He doesn't want to have to deal with their response, their reaction head on. We see it with everyone, with Wolsey, with Cromwell, with
yeah.
Catherine Howard, with Catherine of Aragon, and we see it here with Anne as well. So I actually think that makes perfect sense that it's perhaps Anne that has noticed something and is trying to get some answers from her husband. Of course, she
Yeah.
doesn't get any. So for the 1st of May. Now, remember, think back to when we talked about the accident, the training accident at Greenwich. It's likely that this is what Henry was training for,
Yeah.
to be the star of the May Day joust. Now, unfortunately, as we've already said, Henry was unable to joust formally after that anymore. So he's not the star. You know, despite all of this that's going on, the Tudor court always has a facade up, doesn't it? You
Yeah.
know, Henry always has a facade up. He's a player. He is always putting on a performance. And he continues with this day's performance, as does Anne. You know, she must be so stressed, Owen, yet she gets up, she gets ready, you know, to attend this very special day at the court, you know, May Day joust, traditionally a day of a lot of fun. This is unfortunately not a day of fun. The men
No.
we talked about that probably witnessed Henry's fall are the stars of this show. So there's entertainments at Greenwich, there's the May Day joust. As usual, Lord Rochford, Sir George Boleyn is leading the challengers as far as we know. Henry Norris, the defenders, Francis Weston, William Brereton, also reported as having taken part. I think this confuses people because I actually think by this point Mark Smeaton's been arrested.
Yes.
There is
Yeah.
a source to suggest that that is the case. That things are contradictory. They're difficult. It's all messy. But I think he was arrested straight after the drama of the weekend. I
Yeah.
think Cromwell's got him right at this point, and I think he's talked as well. And I can't blame, we can't blame him for that. I don't think we have evidence of torture used as is sometimes suggested. Physical torture, I should say. Psychological torture, on the other hand, I have no doubt. And let's think what he's facing:
Yeah.
hanging, drawing, and quartering. That's enough, I think, to make anyone talk, really. So it does appear that he may have already implicated a couple of people. And of course, having known the conversation with Norris, they would have been pushing the Norris, and it seems that he's inadvertently, put George Boleyn in as well.
Yeah.
But for now, everything appears okay. The men are doing their jousting. And I suggest that this is just Henry demonstrating his fondness for theatrics. He has picked this. This is the day he has picked specifically to make his exit, to turn his back
Yeah.
on all these people that he's known for so long, that he's supposedly meant to have loved. He puts them on that pedestal one final time. Anne is on her stage as queen. The men are the stars of the joust. And what does he do straight after? He topples them. He absolutely crushes all of them. And again, I think this is to show, the king wants to show that regardless of what it may look like, he is always in control. He is, I call him the ultimate puppeteer. He's pulling those strings and he has them all in the palm of his hands. And whenever it takes his fancy, he can crush them. And this is certainly what happens here. It's it's so, the contrast between, the beauty of the pageant and then what goes on to happen to these people is just horrendous. It's so brutal and so callous that it's difficult to look at, isn't it, Owen?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, in some regards, the rhythm of the court is very predictable.
Yeah.
It's just the people who perform in them that change. But this feels particularly it feels contrived in a way that this is the moment. There's this one moment of glory before that they are spectacularly toppled. So it feels very orchestrated, particularly that Henry leaves. There's reportedly this conversation between Norris and the king. And this brings me on to point 16, which of course is the arrests. Now, I completely agree with you. I think Mark Smeaton was taken almost immediately after Cromwell heard and news got back to Henry about this conversation that they had. I think it's likely that he gave them something. What that was, we have no idea. There is something that sort of ignites the touch paper, I think, that sets all of this in motion, that they've got one confession. Um, so Henry Norris is imprisoned. George Boleyn is arrested, tragically, we think, on his way to Whitehall to petition the king. And he is also imprisoned. Um, Anne Boleyn herself is arrested, not having been watching a tennis match.
Not that we can
Uh,
find any evidence for
Not
that.
that
Yeah.
we can find any evidence of, although this is oft repeated. We do know that she is brought to the council, that she is then held and then transported by barge from Greenwich to the Tower of London. We know that she is greeted by Sir Edmund Walsingham, and that she doesn't enter via Traitor's Gate, but rather lands at what is now called the Queen's Steps. She passes over the drawbridge and then into the Byward postern. This is essentially the court gate, the royal entrance into the tower. She has trod in these footsteps before, for the event of her coronation, when Henry would greet her at the point where Edward Walsingham does. And she's then taken to the royal apartments, which were really rebuilt. Her part of the palace apartments in the innermost ward, just to the south of the White Tower. This is where Anne resided before her coronation, and she's escorted there by the constable. And she has a moment where she fears that she is to be lodged in a dungeon, and William Kingston uh, tells her that she is to be lodged in her apartments. She breaks down at this point and states that they are too good for her, and then she requests that the sacrament be brought to her closet in her apartments. And she expresses great concern for her family, especially for her brother. And she fires off, peppers Kingston with many, many questions. She obviously has very little understanding of what it is exactly that she has done. And that is the point. Anne is kept completely in the dark as to what exactly it is that she is suspected of, is being charged with, is to be tried for. And she is essentially given ladies who will spy on her. One of them being Lady Kingston, the constable's wife, who essentially has to stay with her in her privy apartments day and night. And they are feeding back to the constable, who is sending dispatches to Cromwell. Pretty much everything that Anne is saying, or which is believed to have been of importance, is going firstly past Kingston's desk and then to Cromwell. This is a horrific time for Anne. It is a moment of increased anguish. We see her flitting between hope and despair throughout these days. It is incredibly uncomfortable to read those dispatches, to sort of look at the emotional landscape of Anne during this time. She is really going through the ringer. And I think that's kind of the point. They wanted to rely on that to make her ask questions, to make her give details to these women, some of whom she knew very well indeed. One of them was her aunt. So
Yes.
yeah, it's a really quite awful series of events. She, of course, is going to be tried within the precincts of the tower, also in the Great Hall where she dined the night before her coronation. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, sits in judgment upon her. There are 26 peers of the realm, but one of them is not her father. This is again often stated in popular accounts, but mercifully, I think Thomas is not one of those who is sitting on judgment on Anne. George, tell us a
Exactly.
little bit more about the trial itself.
Yeah, so we're going to move to the trial that takes place within the Tower complex in the Great Hall, as you've said, on the 15th of May. So this comes after the other men have already been tried. So only Anne and George are given this trial because of their status. They will be judged by 26 peers of the realm. The other men have already been found guilty. So this is, of course, a foregone conclusion. But it's an important moment. It is a very important moment. So we know that Sir William Kingston leads Anne into the courtroom. The indictment is then almost suddenly read to Anne. So this is the first time she now knows the full extent. She already knows that she's been accused of adultery, but now
Yeah.
she finds out the full extent of the charges presented here. She listens to these charges. We don't actually know what happened every moment in Anne's trial because there is no like
No.
modern day court transcript of the trial. So we have to piece together the events through the reports of ambassadors and other documents. So we, in general, in cases of high treason, the prisoner might be allowed to respond after the indictment is read. The jury will then, of course, deliberate on their verdict, and then each peer will announce whether they're guilty or not guilty. The prisoner might also be allowed to respond at that point. So we're not 100% sure when Anne may have had a chance to say something, but it's likely that she did say something brief at some
Yeah.
point. She, of course, pleads not guilty to all the charges. She's and in terms of what she's actually charged with, essentially it's multiple cases of adultery with Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and Mark Smeaton. She's also charged with incest, accused of having had an incestuous relationship with her brother George Boleyn, and crucially, conspiring the king's death. She pleads not guilty to all these charges, but she is found guilty of all of the charges. So the indictment goes into quite lurid details about Anne's behavior. You know, this is, of course, meant to completely annihilate her reputation. She's painted as this sexually voracious woman, sinful woman who basically brought down all the men, to be honest. She's blamed for, the fall of George and the other men. So apart from committing adultery, it's also alleged that she gave them gifts. And that and according to Chapuis, in fact, he says that Anne and George were also charged with having laughed at the king's dress and at certain ballads that he'd composed. There is also a suggestion by Chapuis, although we don't see this in the indictment, that Anne had intended on poisoning Catherine of Aragon and also planned to poison the Lady Mary. But this doesn't appear in the formal indictment. But what does is that apparently she'd plotted the king's death and destruction, and that she'd affirmed, and this is quite interesting detail to include in this, I think, in a legal document, that she'd never truly loved the king in her heart and that she'd promised to marry one of them. So it paints a very negative picture of Anne, of course, but she says that she is not guilty. And apparently, from what we know of reports, she defends herself very ably as well. But it doesn't matter. This has been decided before Anne ever entered the courtroom, so to speak. There is no evidence. There's no substantive evidence. There's no witnesses. This is all hearsay. Basically, rumors is what gets Anne killed. In terms of the trial documents, we have all the documents you'd expect to have. They all survived. What we don't have are those witness statements, or perhaps, if they interrogated any of the ladies, as Cromwell suggests in his letters. We don't have any of that. We don't have witness statements. We don't have pretrial examinations. So I don't know whether any of her ladies were interrogated is up for debate as well.
Yeah, it
We
is.
have Sir John Spellman, who we know was there and recording some of the proceedings. He says, and unfortunately, his original recordings are missing or lost. So this comes from the 17th century. But apparently, he claimed that it was all kind of bordery and lechery in terms of Anne's life, and that a lady called Lady Wingfield had apparently disclosed something on her deathbed. That is as close as we get to a sort of witness statement.
Yeah.
But let's remember this comes from a 17th century account. And if this is Bridget Wiltshire that he's referring to, had apparently died a couple of years before, so it's very difficult to know exactly what this is. John Hussey claims that the main accuser was the Lady Worcester, Nan Cobham, and another maid. But again, we just don't have the details to say what exactly is happening here. The only evidence of incest with George appears to be that she one day spent a long time with him, which even Chapuis thought was absolutely ridiculous to use as
Yeah.
evidence. In terms of George, he's also tried. George is tried right after Anne by the same people minus Henry Percy, interestingly, which falls ill during Anne's trial. Same thing. Defends himself ably, pleads not guilty to everything, is of course found guilty of all the charges. So they were both condemned by their own uncle and condemned to die, a traitor's death unless Henry saw fit to commute it. It is an awful day, of course, but it shows the level of people we're talking about here. They were formidable opponents. They were incredible during these trials to be able to maintain their composure when you know that what's being laid against you are completely false accusations. It's quite amazing how they were able to stand up and defend themselves so ably. They were completely and utterly formidable opponents, and it proves why Cromwell had to get rid of them.
It really does. I mean, if there's any question as to why George had to be involved here, it's at this moment. I mean, that they are, even Chapuis says that they are betting that he will get off because of his performance, even though the Queen has already been found guilty, because he puts in such a great defence. So this absolutely exemplifies why George had to go too, because he was a fighter like his sister. I think it's you know indicative of how much they loved each other.
Yeah.
That they do fight, they do so with dignity. Um, and just to also add that we don't have a huge amount of documentation here. Ewan Roger, who does amazing work at the National Archives, very astutely pointed out that in terms of legal records, this is precisely what we would expect to
Yeah.
find. But with Catherine Howard's downfall, we also have drafts
Yeah.
of confessions, revisions. We have revisions to Jane Rochford's confession. It was expedient to keep that additional information as to why these individuals were going to be executed. We just don't have this documentation kept for Anne and George. Now, either it wasn't expedient to keep it because they didn't want people probing into the hows and whys, or it simply didn't need to exist. I think we do have to consider that when those 26 peers entered into the courtroom to sit on judgment on behalf of the king of his queen, was any evidence really necessary? Henry's not going to allow his queen to be tried unless he believes her to be guilty. So it does make you question whether or not these documents ever existed. I think it's certainly possible. Another, of course, very opaque moment, which is our number 18, is Anne's meeting with Cranmer. We know that he does visit her, and we know that shortly thereafter, Anne is both in hope of life and stating that she likely will go into a nunnery. We also know that shortly thereafter, the marriage is annulled. Did Cranmer visit her to try and get something from Anne? Something that would validate an annulment of the marriage? Did he simply ask her to agree to annul the marriage, to not, put up any kind of resistance to it? Did he offer her a deal? I think, considering that she is still in hope of life, having been condemned to death,
Yeah.
that we have to consider the possibility that there was an offer of some kind, and that offer was never delivered. It must have been horrific for Cranmer to have to do this, because he has a long history with Anne.
Yeah.
If there is someone at court who is devoted to her, who's pretty much the only person who is prepared to stand up and say, I am amazed
Yeah.
that this could be considered of her, although he tempers it with, but if have gone this far, I'm sure she must have deserved it, Your Majesty. This must have been very trying for Cranmer indeed. And I think when we see his reaction after Anne's execution, this might explain why he acted in the way that he did. I do think there was a bargaining moment going on here, but we just don't know, unfortunately.
No, we don't. But it is, I really hope that he didn't go in purposely trying to deceive her. That would be
No,
quite
yeah,
heartbreaking, considering, as we've said, he is one of only a few people that speak out for her and that really support her. So, but yes, it must have been really, really quite difficult. However, the next day, Owen, after Cranmer's visit, so Anne is in hope of life on the 16th of May. I dare say that all hope is extinguished on the 17th of May, because that is our moment 19, and it is the execution of George Boleyn, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and Mark Smeaton. You know, we talk about this so much that it's hard to grasp how brutal this day was. You know, these men, all of them, favored men at court, you know, much liked, most of them. I know there's some talk about William Brereton perhaps not being as popular, but the other men were certainly popular. People loved them, looked up to them. They all had families. They all had people that loved them, that cared for them. No one was able to help them. There was no possible way. Once the king has decided he wants you dead, there's literally nothing anybody can do. You know, their family members must have felt so helpless in light of what was going on. Absolutely, the injustice of it is what kind of burns me. You know, I find it so hard to deal with this. However, Anne, of course, knows that her brother has been executed. The men are taken. Their execution is a public execution, so up on Tower Hill. Lots of people there to witness the end of these once great men. And they are callously, one by one, chopped down. And it is literally the scene of a nightmare by the end of
yeah.
this, because they are all executed one after the other, starting with George, working your way through down the ranks. So the last one is Smeaton. Can you just for a moment imagine the scene that must have been in front of him? It's impossible almost to imagine it, what he must have seen, and then having to submit himself. And then they're all just popped onto a cart and, you know, taken back to the tower to be buried. So Anne knows that her brother's been executed. I don't think there is a suggestion. Bishop is the only one that says that she was forced to watch the executions from somewhere in the tower. I suppose it's possible, but we certainly don't have a record of her being moved or any of that happening. She couldn't have seen from her apartments, the royal apartments. But
No.
regardless of whether she saw or not, she no doubt was able to imagine what her brother went through. And they had a great bond, an incredible bond. And this bond has been twisted into this accusation of incest. So it's evidence of their close bond, I suppose, in a strange way. They were two peas in a pod. They were incredible. They were brilliant. And yes, they left Henry feeling very inadequate. And they were fighters, as you've said. And this is why George ends his life on the scaffold, because there's no way he would have stayed quiet with his sister imprisoned on these charges. So it's tragic, but I think this is when Anne gives up that hope that she had the day before and prepares for her own execution, which she thinks is actually going to happen the following day on the 18th of May, but Henry delays it. So we know that she's in fact executed on the 19th of May. Do you want to tell us maybe a little bit about our final moment, which of course is Anne's execution?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you. I think, Anne has given up all hope of life. I think it's very unlikely that she saw her brother die or the other men. The only real vantage point, the upper cell of the bell tower, which you and I have been in,
Yeah, yeah.
and we know that someone does witness that. It's Thomas Wyatt, and he speaks of viewing those executions from that side. So I think it's highly unlikely that Anne saw it. She definitely would have heard it though. There would have been absolutely no way of escaping the roar of those crowds. It would have been absolutely horrific for her. So I think she gives up hope of life at that point, and I think she is resolved to die the next day. But she does discover, much to her upset, that the execution is delayed. I think she struggles at this point. We see that dark humour returning. It's at this point that she talks about being Anne Lackhead, and also about her little neck and such like. So she has been flitting sort of between hope and despair. But now I think she's entering a period of resolve. I think knowing that she's going to die on the 18th of May, she very likely did not sleep particularly well. And then knowing that she's going to die the day after, again, I think we're probably looking at a woman that's had 2 nights of no sleep. She probably didn't sleep particularly well, knowing that her brother was going to die on the 17th of May either. So we're probably looking at someone at a very vulnerable position, not least because she knows now that she's going to die. I don't know if anyone's had 3 nights of not sleeping, but
No.
it puts you in a very particular kind of state, I guess. Um, you almost get a sense of euphoria, as well as sort of complete exhaustion, and that is precisely what observers say, that she looks exhausted, but having never looked so beautiful and calm and composed. She would have been awoken very early in the Queen's apartments. The execution was due for around 8 a.m. That was sort of the typical time for an execution. She dressed in her apartments, and we know that she wears a bonnet and frontlet on her head, or an English gable hood. Um, we know that she was wearing a dark damask gown, either grey or black, and that she had a red kirtle on. People often comment on the way that she presents herself at this point. I think it is important that she is dressing her best. She has an ermine mantle on. This is, of course, early in the morning in May. Whilst it can be quite warm in May, it certainly isn't first thing in the morning. I always like to temper people's reading of what Anne wears on the basis that she has no control over what her wardrobe is anymore.
Yeah.
So she doesn't have time to pack before she goes to the tower, and therefore she probably has quite a limited wardrobe. And therefore I think we do have to be careful when we talk about trying to look like an English
Mm.
queen, trying to evoke images of martyrdom with the color red. Red actually was a very common color for a kirtle. It was believed to have health benefits. So I'm always slightly cautious about reading too much into what Anne wore, because I'm not sure how much control she actually had at this point
That's a very good
over
point.
what she wore. She would have exited the palatial complex via the Cold Harbour Gate, and the scaffold was erected before the Houses of Ordnance, which is just to the north of the White Tower. That would have given a really rather large crowd for a private execution, enough space to observe the horror that was about to unfold. She was led to the scaffold, which was newly erected on the green there, and she was given leave to address the crowd. She makes no public admission of any sin. And she simply states that the law has condemned her and she will not speak against it. So this actually seems like quite a compliant speech to a modern audience. She talks about the wonderful king, and how good he is, has been to her. But what people will be expecting is an admission of guilt. They will expect her to say that she is a woeful sinner. If you look at most execution speeches, people accept that they deserve to
Yeah.
die. She doesn't do that, and that would have rung quite loudly in the ears of those who are watching. There is a report that on her way to the scaffold, Anne is looking around her, that she's looking back. People have read this as Anne expecting some kind of reprieve. I'm never too sure that Anne believes that there's going to be any kind of reprieve, to be honest. I think the moment that her brother is dead,
Mm.
that she knows that the game is up. But I think we have to go back to the fact that this is a woman of who's probably had very little sleep and who knows she's about to die. And she remains calm and composed. The ermine mantle is taken off her. She takes off the English gable hood herself, and she does have some final words with the ladies who accompany her to the scaffold. She then pays the executioner. Um, he's paid £23, 6 shillings, and 8 pence to kill Anne. He has been dispatched from Calais. We don't actually know where he himself came from, what
No,
his
because
nationality
normally you
of.
said the French executioner, isn't he? But we don't know that he was French.
No, we don't, because Calais is held by the English at the time. So he may well have been from the Habsburg court. In fact, we know that this kind of execution was very common in Mechlin. There are paintings that survive which show exactly what we're about to talk about now. Anne would have knelt into the straw of the scaffold. We know that she is then blindfolded, and depending on what account you read, it appears that the executioner did something to distract Anne. Her last words are in prayer, and it is likely that the executioner does something akin to asking for his sword. We have this in one account, which is, I think, an attempt to get Anne to look in a different
Yes.
direction.
Yeah.
We know that she's been nervously, and when I say look, she is blindfolded. It's simply about turning head and also not flinching. The method of execution is quite a precise one. We know that she dies with one blow, mercifully, but most individuals who die in this manner, and going back to those contemporary illustrations of this happening in Mechlin, where of course Anne was educated, the victims are always bound. Their hands are bound around them so that they cannot move. This doesn't happen to Anne, and therefore she simply has to hold her head up high and await the blow. Just absolutely horrific. I mentioned that mercifully she dies with one blow, and it's traditionally said that there was no provision made for a coffin, and that the Queen's remains are placed in an elm arrow chest, which contain bow staves destined for Ireland. However, this is a marginal note which you discovered. I don't know if you'd like to say a little bit about that
Oh, I can if
discovery.
you'd like me to. Yes, so
Please.
we often hear the arrow chest story. Of course, it adds drama, doesn't it, to this already dramatic event. And can I just say it's possible that she was buried in an arrow chest,
Yeah.
but I would like to suggest another alternative option, and that's that there was just a simple coffin waiting for the Queen. And the reason I say this is because the arrow chest story comes from Mr. Anthony Anthony. What's the saying? Never trust a man with two first names or something like that. But anyway, Mr. Anthony
Yeah.
Anthony, who was surveyor of the ordnance at the Tower of London, he was there at the time of Anne's execution. So that's all sounding really good. But what is rarely noted, Owen, is that the diary in which he recorded the events of Anne's execution has been lost. It's been lost
Yes.
for a long time. And so, what historians rely on is a 17th century copy of the life and reign of King Henry VIII by Herbert of Cherbury. And it's according to some annotations made in this book that we know that apparently Anthony Anthony in his journal recorded that Anne was buried in an arrow chest. So you can see how convoluted the story is, and it's not very straightforward. However, when I was doing my research, I did come across a contemporary account, a foreign account, but contemporary, that says that there was a simple coffin provided for the Queen, and that's after, her clothing was removed and whatnot, she was placed in there, and then she's buried where we know she's buried, which is in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower. Exactly where in the chapel is another discussion, which we don't have time for now, but except to say that she is somewhere in that chapel, and her brother as well, and lots of other very notable Tudor personalities are there as well. So it's this Italian contemporary account that I think we need to consider. And thinking about the fact that Henry oversaw every single detail of this, that we've talked about the fact that this is choreographed. This to Henry is theatre, and he needs to come out looking as though he's done everything right. He's done everything by the book. He's justified in having these people executed because they are traitors. So do you know what I'm saying? That
I
he's
do.
overseen everything. So to me, leaving out the coffin just doesn't seem right to me. I feel like a
No.
simple coffin makes more sense for the Queen or the former Queen, although she continues to be called Queen, to be buried in. So just something for us to keep in mind when we talk about this period of history and all periods of history, really. And when we say this is definitely what happened, are we sure it's definitely what happened? And there are so many moments like that in Anne's story in particular, because it is a story that's been so interpreted and represented on screen and in books and in plays and all sorts of different things. So, and I know it's still a story that stirs up a lot of emotion in a lot of people,
It does.
whether they're in support of Anne or whether they feel that this in some way was some sort of karmic justice, which I find horrendous. But there are
Yeah.
people that will say that she deserved this for what she'd done to Catherine of Aragon. And I think that approach is just not in any way helpful or constructive. I think we need to look at the brutality of this event. And I do think, Owen, that this, and I'd be interested in hearing what you think, but I think this changes the Tudor court. I really
Oh,
do think
totally.
the execution of Anne, George, and the men alongside them really alters the face of the Tudor court. I think it leaves a gaping hole, and I think it's something that Henry tries to fill for the rest of his reign and simply cannot. It's hard to kind of capture what this meant, but I think we need to think about how people the place at court that people thought they had now, nobody is safe. Nobody is
No.
safe around
I
Henry.
mean, Thomas More famously apparently said, about never showing Henry his own strength. Henry now not only knows his own strength, but everyone else knows it too. Because if the Queen of England can be led to a scaffold and beheaded like this, no one is safe. So this is not just Henry knowing his own strength, it's everyone else knowing his strength as well. I mean, things are never the same again. You're
No.
right. It's written in those instructions, those really creepy instructions that Henry gives, that this is the precedent to be set for the execution of a queen and all future queens. I mean, it would have been unthinkable to people that a queen of England could be put to death, but for Henry, there was the prospect that this could happen again, and of course it does. Absolutely chilling. Things are never the same. And
No.
arguably, this sets a precedent for the execution of a regnant as well, which we see during the reign of Elizabeth with Mary, Queen of Scots, who, of course, had abdicated, and then, not a generation later with the execution of Charles I. I think it changed everything.
Yeah, it really did. And it's harrowing to look into it, but I think we do need to look into it and to keep our minds open to new interpretations because, of course, the history is fluid in a way, isn't it? Because it's us
It
interpreting
is.
it and using any new evidence that comes to light. I think in the end, it's very difficult with this story to kind of make a closing statement about whether, who was ultimately responsible. I do feel very much that we cannot let Henry off the hook. That to me is something I always like to make sure I'm underlining. I think Henry is responsible for this. Yes, Thomas Cromwell plays a very crucial role. And we've seen that this is something that you cannot analyze with one sentence, one paragraph, three paragraphs. This is something that you need to really closely look at the nature of relationships at this point, the Tudor court, kingship, queenship, to fully understand it. But it doesn't take away from the absolute brutality of this moment and why so many of us still, of course, talk about it and think about it. So I would just say that perhaps remind people if they'd like to look at some more detail about this, to look at those conversations we had, two-part series on Anne's fall. I did also speak to the wonderful Dr. Dan Gosling about
Yes.
every single record that survives. So if you're interested in understanding what survives in the National Archives, in the Bag of Secrets, as it's called, related to Anne's trial, tune into that episode. He was incredible and explained everything so clearly and so well. Owen, ultimate, here's the question. Why did she have to die?
Gosh, it's complex, isn't it?
It is.
I think if I'm going to sum it up succinctly, she died because Henry wanted her to.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly right. Yeah.
and, there are a lot of factors that led to that decision. Um, but ultimately, why she dies is because Henry let her. Now, I do still have questions because I think whilst Henry was the commissioner of Anne's end, I do think Cromwell was very much the architect of it.
Yeah.
And I think it was within his best interest to make Anne's exit from Henry's life a permanent one. I don't know what Anne's end would have looked like had she not threatened Cromwell just at the point that Henry was giving up all love or obsession for her, that he was determined to get Anne out of his life. Maybe it would have looked different. But there's another part of me that thinks, no, absolutely, this was always going to end in Anne's death. Chiefly, I think, because of how difficult it posed um, to Anne and Henry's marriage that Catherine remained alive, and that people considered her to be the valid queen. Henry simply couldn't have that again.
Mm.
I don't think he had the ability to go through and deal with another rupture like that. So ultimately, I think she died because Henry wanted her dead.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to agree with you. Lots of factors, of course, contributing, but in the end, I think the buck stops with Henry, and they all died because Henry wanted them dead. Oh, what an incredible event in history. And thank you so much for discussing this with me, Owen. It's always amazing to talk to someone, of course, that's so invested in this story as I am. And thank you to all our amazing listeners. Of course, if you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to leave a comment below or a question. We're more than happy to answer anything. And if you're listening to this, thank you so much for tuning in. Do go and have a listen to some of those other episodes. And I'm sure we'll have another installment on something interesting for you all very soon. So again, Owen, thank you so much for joining me on this very special episode of Talking Tudors.
Pleasure. Bye bye.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining me. If you've enjoyed the show, please spread the word on your socials and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join the Talking Tudors Patreon community for some fun, exclusive content and the Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind the scenes news. You'll also find me on Instagram. My handle is themosthappy78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.